Well, can everybody hear me okay? I found the concept of treasure to be pretty difficult. After I'd been asked to read, I kind of thought to myself, oh, what am I going to make of this? How can I incorporate myself into this theme? I think it probably, in some ways, might have been easier with the other two memoirs, which were dark and about recovering from my mother's suicide and my own depression and the treasure of returning to life. This book is very, very different, and it took me a while to come to it, to really be ready to write something lighter that wasn't so steeped in sadness. And I thought to myself as I was sitting here, it really, for me, it's the treasure of having rediscovered the pleasure and the laughter that was actually in my childhood. The story of my family's life with the tribe of 38 Dalmatians that romped through our years together is the story of a crazy kind of love affair. How is it possible to love so relentlessly this single particular breed, one often described with words like neurotic, nervous, hyper, skitsy, overexcitable, snappish, and downright nasty? The Sextons, however, believed staunchly that those who held such mean-spirited opinions were wrong. Instead, we used words like loving, companionable, lively, mischievous, exuberant, happy, and smart. We had always rooted for the underdog, perhaps because we were underdogs ourselves, crippled by the shadow of my mother's continuing mental illness. As an artist who spent her hours creating a radical new kind of poetry, my mother always counseled us to look below the surface, to see the possibilities of every day around us. And these dogs fit into that category of unrealized potential quite neatly. When I was a child, Dalmatians were the breed we adored, unequivocally. Dalmatians were the breed we always picked when one beloved dog passed on and we had to choose another as quickly as possible, as was the custom of the times. When one member of the family was gone, we filled the void right away, preferably with a soft, cuddly pup who would undoubtedly pee from one end of the house to the other, or chew up prized objects like slippers, glasses, baseboards, and rugs. In a home where my parents were both inconsistent and inconstant because of my father's anger and my mother's illness, the dogs became symbols of absolute love, of fortitude. If they could survive such difficulties, so could we. My love for the intensely colored dogs did not wane as I created a new family of my own. I took it with me, the way one would carry forward a love of climbing steep mountain peaks or swimming in deep lakes. None of these dogs were perfect. All of them had their idiosyncrasies, but each and every one dropped into our lives much more happiness and joy than they did anger and frustration. As I brought my first dog home to my own children, it never even occurred to me to consider any other breed. Dalmatians were in my blood. Now, as I look back over my 60 years, I realize that sometimes it is in the nature of miracles not to occur in a crisis, but in the most mundane of circumstances, blossoming out of everyday existence into something as yet unrecognized. It was 5:30 in the morning on that dark winter weekday in 1966, the floor chilly beneath my feet. I was about to turn 13. As I dialed the thermostat in the hall up to 68 degrees, a peculiar noise threaded through the silence of the house, with high-pitched, intermittent squeaks and squeals. I tiptoed down to the first floor, searching, uneasy. The sound grew louder. When I reached the door to the basement stairs, it hit me. In the stillness of this quiet dawn, life was arriving. I ran to broadcast the news to my parents and my sister Joy, calling through the hall between the bedrooms in a loud but shaky voice, and then bounded down the stairs 3 at a time to return to what we had all been anticipating for weeks. In the wooden pen my father had built from inside the cave of a large cardboard box that had once held a case of toilet tissue, birth was taking place. For the last 2 weeks, our Dalmatian Penny had been incarcerated in the basement, amid the old rocking horses, the discarded rolls of rugs, and an old television set without an antenna, heavy-bellied and lethargic, waiting for her time. Now, 2 puppies crawled blindly, bumping up against the sides. Their mother didn't take notice of them, or perhaps she simply couldn't, for as I watched, Penny heaved and panted, whimpered, and then pushed, hard. And at last, a dark, slimy bubble, the size of a baby's slipper, slid out in a whoosh of liquid from the space between her hind legs. My sister and my parents came down the stairs in a wave, filling the room with noise and activity, and I felt less anxious and alone. My father began to search the whelping box for more puppies and discovered 2 wedged into a corner, crying weakly but insistently as they looked blindly for the warmth of their mother's body. My mother sat and smoked a cigarette, musing, it seemed, perhaps caught up in quiet awe at the way life was unfolding in our basement right at her knees. She was a woman fascinated with death, having tried to kill herself innumerable, uncountable times. The puppy's arrival, however, brought a vision of abundant life into her psyche, and thus into our lives on that day. My parents had neglected to spay Penny when we got her as a young dog in the autumn months of 1966, and so shortly thereafter, just as biology dictated, Penny came into heat. My parents shut her in the backyard with its 6-foot fence, topped with pointed pickets, confident that she could not get out. But Penny clambered right up that expensive fence for an assignation with one of the neighborhood Lotharios, a mutt named Herbie, who belonged to my best friend. Horrified by the idea of a litter of mongrel pups, my parents rapidly decided to breed her again the next day, intentionally this time, to a friend's Dalmatian boy, hoping that his seed would swim faster than Herbie's and rescue them from the situation. Caesar arrived with Maxine and Vic Cumin in tow. Maxine was my mother's writing cohort, best friend, and big sister. They had both become poets at the same time and had risen to similar levels of prominence in the early 60s, and both eventually went on to win Pulitzer Prizes. Apparently, Penny was ripe as a peach. Caesar chased her all around the backyard, and Joy and I, having been banished off stage by my parents, snuck to watch from the living room window, noses pressed against the glass. Penny scrambled up on the picnic table, but Caesar cornered her before she could even jump down again, and in an instant, he nailed her right up there for all to see. He pumped away, tiptoe, his front paws hooked up nearly at her shoulders to restrain her. Then they stood absolutely still, locked together. However, after a few minutes, he made what seemed an unwise decision and began to turn and dismount. In a moment, they stood still joined, their noses pointed in opposite directions, looking like Siamese twins stuck together, rump to rump. They just stood there. Then Caesar tried to move again, and they tumbled off the table onto the ground. Even this did not dislodge him. Joy and I ran through the house screaming, "They're stuck! They're stuck!" My father and Vic turned the hose on the dogs, swearing and panicked, dousing them with a stream of cold water. It didn't work, nor did trying to pull them apart, nor did standing there and speaking to the soaking wet, shivering dogs with gentle words. These dogs were not about to relax and let go. Joy whispered to me in shock, "They're going to have to cut his penis off." It seems that not even the adults knew what the dogs were doing was something natural. Part of the breeding process is called a tie, where the canine penis, trapped inside the female by its complicated anatomy, acts as an effective dam until the sperm has a good chance to swim up the canal. Eventually, enough time passed that Caesar deflated and was released. As Penny had expanded, looking more and more uncomfortable as the all-too-short 63 days of gestation raced by, my mother and father repeatedly said they would destroy the puppies when they came if they were Herbie's offspring. Joy and I were horrified and begged them not to do it. But my parents didn't want to be stuck with a litter of pups that could not be registered. I want to make sure I'm going to the right place. Keeping to 8 minutes is hard. After watching for a bit with Joy and me in the poorly lit basement, my parents found themselves unable to go and get the pail put aside for the purpose of the planned euthanasia. And shortly it became obvious that it wouldn't be necessary anyway, because all the puppies born were Dalmatians. At the time the puppies arrived in 1966, my mother was in the midst of writing Live or Die, her third volume of poetry, the one for which she would eventually win a Pulitzer Prize 8 years before her death. Up until that point, and despite the title that revealed her ambivalence, much of the book had been occupied with her death wish, including poems like Suicide Note and The Attic. When Penny had at last been made comfortable enough to sleep, my mother went upstairs to her typewriter. As the sound of the little cries floated from the basement up to her writing room, just at the top of the stairs, she began to create a new poem called Live. In its final stanza, she credited the birth of the puppies for her own increasing mood to do just that, to live. The puppies had worked like some kind of magical incantation, transforming her into a state of gratitude. And so I quote, "So I say live and turn my shadow 3 times round, to feed our puppies as they come, the 8 Dalmatians we didn't drown, despite the warnings, the abort, the destroy, despite the pails of water that waited to drown them, to pull them down like stones, they came, each one head first, blowing bubbles the color of cataract blue and fumbling for the tiny tits. Just last week, 8 Dalmatians, 3/4 of a pound, lined up like cordwood, each like a birch tree. I promise to love more if they come. Because of cruelty and the stuffed railroad cars for the ovens, I am not what I expected, not an Eichmann. The poison just didn't take. So I won't hang around in my hospital shift, repeating the black mass and all of it. I say live, live, because of the sun, the dream, the excitable gift." The poem would become one of her most famous, the centerpiece of the book that would win her a national reputation. To the family, it symbolized my mother's return to us, how she had at last turned away from the blackness that tortured us all. It was her rejection of suicide, if only for a time. The Dalmatian puppies had cheated death. Thank you.